Speak Out is a community of speakers working to create a world free of homo, bi, transphobia, and other forms of prejudice by telling the truths of our lives. And we've been doing it since 1972, which means that next year in 2022, it's our 50th anniversary. And we're very proud of the work that we have done in those 50 years. Obviously, there's been a lot of social change happening in those decades. You can find us at speakoutboston.org. And we train members of our community, of our LGBTQ plus community, to go out into many different parts of the world to tell our stories. We go to schools, colleges, businesses, faith communities, public libraries. I was just saying today we went and talked to an elder residence place. So lots of different spaces. Anyone who's interested in making safer and more inclusive spaces for LGBTQ plus people, we want to be there and we want to educate. So we have 3 basic ground rules of all of our engagements. We encourage everyone to communicate with respect amongst each other, especially in the Zoom box right now. And we speak for ourselves and not for the entire LGBTQ plus community. Our community is very diverse, but we can only represent what we know from our own experiences, our own opinions, and we will do that tonight. So, and the third thing is ask us anything. And we really do mean that. That has been our slogan since the beginning. We want people to feel safe with asking questions about us and our stories, or about bigger issues in the LGBTQ plus community. Don't worry about saying the wrong thing, using the wrong word. You're not going to offend us. We might tell you in another situation why something might be not appropriate to ask someone in another setting. But in this space, we like to make people feel as safe as possible to ask things. So we are going to get started with our story, and then we're going to go back and we're going to talk a bit more specifically about the issue of trans athletes. So right now I'm going to go off screen share and we're going to get started with Eli's story.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eli, pronouns are he, him, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how my sports team really helped me in my early transition as a transgender person. So I've been an athlete my whole life. That's one of my core identities, things that bring me joy in life. I was on a boys soccer team from age 7 to 14 and loved that. I remember when they went to hand out the trophies when I was 8 years old, they're handing out the boy trophies, and then I come up and
lots of girls from her squad.
I think someone's unmuted.
Yeah, sorry, Kane, I think you're unmuted.
And then they went to change and give me a girl's trophy, and I was like, no, I want the other trophy. I want the same one my teammates got. Yeah, that was a good experience. And unfortunately, my parents took me off that team when I was 14 because they were afraid I would get hurt. Even though I was the goalkeeper, I wasn't even crashing into anyone unless I did it on purpose. But anyway, yeah, played all through high school, played sports through college. And I transitioned kind of a little bit later in life, around my mid 30s. And at the time I was on the US parachute team. And that was the first place that anyone used my new name. And so it became kind of like a joke on the team. I had been out to them, I was out to everybody in skydiving at least. And they were talking about trying to get me to toughen up. And they're like, all right, we're gonna have to give you a boy name so you can man up in the air, And I was like, well, let's go with this one. Let's go with Eli. And so they started calling me Eli. And it was just felt really awesome. To have one place, because I was closeted with my family. I was closeted at work. And it was just nice to have that one place where that was my name, and I felt really seen and known. And yeah, we competed around the world. It was amazing. But after I went to change my international competitor license that you need to compete internationally, I went to change my name, but my name was still legally Elizabeth. And so they were like, oh, we can't do that. We can't put a name other than your legal name on your card. And so then I went back to them and said, well, you've put, what was the guy's nickname? It was like CJ or something. Like instead of, Cotter, you've put CJ on this guy's card, and you've put Chris on Christopher's card, and you've put, Jack on John's card. So you are willing to put names on these cards that aren't the actual legal name. And then like all these other people in skydiving signed on to it. Like when I said, this is what's happening to me. So all these people with their nicknames on their cards said, put me on your email, like tell them like I support you. And so I have this huge email with all these CCs of all these skydivers with different names on their cards. And it was really interesting because like there'd been like 2 or 3 back and forth emails with this clerk, and they just refused to do it. And I was like, here's some examples of some other people. And they're like, yeah, no, we can't do it, but didn't really give a reason. They just said, this is our policy. I'm like, but it's not your policy. And so finally, like these people sign on, I send the CC to them, and I say like, I really hope this isn't what it looks like. It seems like this is discriminatory. And suddenly, the sky's clear. Like, oh, no. Thank you for your information. Yes, we'll change this right away. And it was one of those really interesting experiences of like, you get asked like, well, have you ever been discriminated against? And there's so many different things like that where I'm like, well, can I say 100% for sure that I was? No, like I can't, but I do know that this thing kept happening to me until I got a bunch of people to support me. And I mentioned that word, and then suddenly it wasn't happening to me. And so that's kind of one of those things that's very tiring, is because you're never quite, most people don't walk up to you and say, you're trans, so I'm going to do this really crappy thing to you now, okay? You don't get a giant billboard like that. You get these kind of subtle little things where you're like, was that a thing? And so that can be exhausting, because then you end up second guessing yourself. No, you're seeing things where there aren't things. It's, it's not a thing. And then eventually you're like, no, that's a thing. So that was, a negative that got turned into a positive, and just showed me how much support I had from the other competitors, like even around the world. It was really great. And it's also a really great sport in that there isn't a clear advantage to having, circulating testosterone, or being tall, or being beefy, or anything like that. It's like powerlifting. There's another sport I've done. Like it's just like men and women and all sorts of folks can compete on fairly even playing fields in almost every skydiving discipline. And so they've set up a structure that reflects that. And so you have just open. It's just called open, and anyone can be on a team, and it's an open division. Now at the world level, just to encourage female participation, they do have a women's category, but even how they pick those folks nationally is really cool. You compete open, and if you have a team that's all women, the top scoring all women's team in the open division becomes like the women's team representative from your country. So they could finish first, they could finish 17th, it doesn't matter. But there's still not like a separate division like men, women, it's open. And that's just a really great aspect of that sport. And I think there are other sports that could go to that kind of model, and there are other ones where there's some things that we'd have to think really hard about whether you want it to go to that kind of model. But this is one where it definitely, like, it's not like you have to have this insane upper body strength or things. So it's been a really great sport to be a part of on multiple levels, and just a really supportive community. With people from all walks of life. I've met all sorts of people in that sport, ranging from, a pastor, very evangelical pastor who was surprisingly perfectly fine with like still jumping with me and stuff after I transitioned. It's been a great opportunity to educate people. A bunch of skydivers have come out to me, or come out about their kids or their nieces or whatever. So it's been a great opportunity to provide support to people just being visibly out as trans in a sport that's a little bit small. So that's just kind of like, I don't want to go on too long, but that's like a quick version of my story, and just one of my many sports, and how both being trans affected the sport and how the sport affected being trans.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Eli. Because I was thinking in my head, aren't you also a curler? Don't you do curling?
Yep, another sport where most of the teams are open. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. I'm sure that'll come up later.
Oh yeah. How do you know a curler's in the room? They'll tell you. Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks for sharing that story. And Jen, great to see you again. And it's time if you'd like to tell your story.
Great. So I'm the T for trans, and I didn't figure it out till I was 53 years old, thanks to an Oprah Winfrey show called Born in the Wrong Body, where I immediately identified a lot of parts of myself and then started to try to figure out who I was. I spent about a month online doing a lot of different research, and the more I found, the actually more worried I became, because I was married at the time with 2 children. And I was pretty convinced that it wasn't going to go well when I told my ex about being trans, which turned out to be true, unfortunately. As she sat there and listened to me explain it to her, she stared right through me as if I wasn't in the room. And at the end of listening to what I had to say, she got up, went upstairs, and took all her clothes out of our closet and moved into the guest room. And that was kind of the beginning of getting divorced. Over the next month, we talked more and more about it. And finally, we decided it was time to tell the children or kids or whatever. They were both in college at the time. My son was at Bentley, and my daughter was at Cornell. My son, we went to visit him and explained to him that I was trans and we'd be getting a divorce. And from that day, which was in 2007 till today, he has never talked about it with anyone. He wouldn't actually express his own feelings the day we told him, and he still hasn't, not even to his wife. My daughter, on the other hand, a little bit different. Being in Cornell, which is 6 hours away, we couldn't just jump in a car and go visit her because of the distance. So my ex-wife decided that she should be the first one to tell our daughter, and that I should wait a week and then call. So after a week, I called and spoke to her and asked her how she was doing. And she said, not good. And there were many reasons for this. One, she was suffering from anxiety attacks. She and her roommate did not get along, and this was her first time with a roommate. And she was gaining weight, which actually was a good thing because she actually didn't weigh enough. She had lost weight all the ways that you don't want your daughter to lose weight the previous summer. And asking her about how she felt about me, she said, well, you're still my dad. And I asked her who she talked to, and she said, no one. And I asked her why, and she said, well, this is kind of a family secret. And it might hurt you if I talk to people about it. And of course, I said, well, you're the only one I know at Cornell, so how could you possibly hurt me? You need to talk about it with as many of your friends as possible, so you can feel supported by them in this kind of difficult time, having a trans dad and your parents getting divorced. After a week went by, I called her again, and I asked her who she had spoken to, and she said, okay, I spoke to all my friends, which happened to be the Cornell cheerleading team because she was a cheerleader. And their reaction was, well, that's really cool. We want to meet your dad, which is pretty funny because I hadn't even decided to transition at that point. I just knew that I had attached the label trans to myself. About 4 months after explaining this to my wife and kids, I got divorced. And then came a period of kind of depression, you would say. I lived for work. That was the only thing that was really keeping me in touch with the world. The minute I got home from work, I would sit in the chair or on the couch and just stare at the wall. I couldn't watch TV, couldn't read, couldn't do anything on the computer, had no interest at all in food. And that went on for maybe 6 months. And finally, thank God I came out of it. And physically, I was fine. I checked in with a doctor to make sure everything was fine and that I hadn't lost too much weight. So today, this was actually my best weight loss plan, was being depressed for a while. I probably lost 20 pounds during that 6 months. And I gained it back and lost it and gained it back, up and down as usual. Anyway, over the next year, I had to decide, who am I? Who's Jen? Well, it wasn't Jen then, but who am I? And what does transgender mean to me? Do I transition? Do I stay a man and cross-dress? What is this? So I had joined a support group of trans women, and we met on Friday nights and went out for dinner, and then we went out clubbing afterwards. And over a year and a half, what was in my closet changed. It went from being mostly men's clothes to mostly women's clothes. And I really do mean mostly. A 6-foot closet of women's clothes and a couple pairs of pants and a couple shirts that were guys, and that's about it. So it became really obvious that I needed to transition, because every day I couldn't wait to get home from work and get rid of my guy clothes, because that was like a costume that I was wearing. And I didn't want to wear that any longer. So I made the decision to start transitioning. And the first thing to transition was my face. I had a facial feminization surgery. And that's what everybody sees. So it was the most obvious thing to do. I had a few other things done at the same time. I had a broken nose, which since middle school, which I had caused a big bump in the middle of my nose. So I had that taken off, and I could finally breathe again after surgery through my nose. And of course, while I was on the table being really practical, I said, could you take 10 years off and do a facelift? That came out really good. My 4 sisters were very jealous because I looked younger than them, although I looked more like them at the same time, which I really love. People recognize that we're from the same family whenever I'm with them now, which had not happened before, because previously I was the oddball. Previously I was the man and they were all women. They all had blonde hair and I had brown hair. They had blue eyes and I had green eyes. So everything about me had previously been different. Transitioning at work was going to be a challenge for me because I couldn't do it in a small manner. And the reason was I was a high school teacher and had been in a high school for 10 years. And I was known in the school as the guy's guy. I was the shop teacher teaching woodworking, among other things. But people came to me from all over the school asking me how to fix things, how to fix their cars, how to build. And all of a sudden I was going to transition, so it was going to affect them. Now, me transitioning caused a little bit of an issue for other people because they have to transition in some way also, the way they look at me and the way they deal with me. And they're not choosing to transition. I'm forcing them into it. So I felt very responsible to help them in the best way I could. So I held meetings with the administration, split the teachers up into 4 different groups to talk to, the custodians, the women in the lunchroom. They were the funniest group because they demanded to see pictures of me on Friday nights when I was dressed as a woman. And they wanted to really comment on how good I looked. And at the end of having all these meetings, that was the beginning of my summer. I'd had my facial surgery. Coming back, I was the cover story of the school paper. And immediately everyone in the school found out at once. And not only one school, but due to budget cuts, I had to teach in 2 high schools that year, both Newton South and Newton North. So within a week-long period, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 people found out about me all at once. So I don't think I'll ever hit that number again for coming out to people. But if it does, I'm fine with it. It's not a big deal. I am out everywhere in my life, and I don't care who knows. I live my life completely in the open, and it actually makes for a wonderful life. And I'll pass that back out to Ellen.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And I know one of the things that we wanted to discuss with you was because I know you're quite an athlete, and you've been involved with a skiing club and some other things. And it'd be great to have sort of your experience with that aspect. Can you share a little bit about maybe, because I think that was really important when you were transitioning, and how people dealt with you with that as well.
Sure. So after I transitioned, I decided that I needed to be out in the world and enjoy everything that I had. And I'm a snow skier and I love to ski. So I rejoined a ski club that I had belonged to back in the 1970s. And almost all of the members had changed since then. So nobody remembered what I looked like as a guy because they weren't there. But it was a bit of a challenge joining this group because we own a building in North Conway, New Hampshire, and we have bunk rooms, men's rooms and women's rooms. At the time I rejoined, I had had my facial surgery, but I didn't have my bottom surgery yet. So I had male genitalia, but I looked like a woman and wanted to be treated that way. So it was a challenge for the club to figure out, what to do with me. When I spoke with one of their board of director members, he eventually came around to ask me whether I still had one. And I was expecting that question. And of course, we didn't use the real terms. We just said had one. And I said, yes, I do. But if it's a problem and you don't feel I can stay in the women's rooms, then I don't even want to be a member of the club. And he said to me, we'll get back to you. And after a week, he called me and said, we would like you to come up. Every one of the board of directors would love to have you come for this upcoming weekend and be our guest. And I went up the next weekend, and there were 3 women there who immediately grabbed me and said, you're staying with us in our room, and we're going to take care of you the whole weekend to make sure that you feel welcome in our club. And after the weekend, I was talking with many different people in the club, and there are 50 plus members in this club. I felt completely welcomed, and the board of directors voted on me unanimously to become a member of the club. Now, of course, to their benefit, they found out that I knew how to fix things. So immediately I became the chair of buildings and lands, and I've held positions as vice president. I've been on the board of directors and have had a wonderful experience with this large group of people. Now, if any of you have ever been involved in a ski club, you may know that Saturdays are party days up north. And every day after skiing, there's what's called an M&M. It used to stand for Manhattans and Martinis. And everyone would go from the ski slope to one of these parties and dance and talk and drink, and then go back to their own club for dinner, and then go to a second party at night at 9 o'clock and stay out till 1 and party some more. It's amazing that I did this when I was in my 20s, and we're still doing this in our 60s, and some of our members in their 70s. For the vast majority of the parties I go to, I feel pretty accepted, but there are occasions where it doesn't work out so well for me. One party I was at, I was speaking with a gentleman, and our drinks were empty, so we went to the bar, and I got my drink and stepped away, and he got his. While he was at the bar, another woman spoke with him. And when he returned to talk to me again, he said, within maybe 2 minutes of coming back, he said, well, I have to go, sir, to me, and walked away. So I don't know what that woman had said to him, but I took it in a positive manner. I figured she was jealous because I felt I looked better than she did. So it didn't bother me too much, but it's, it can be a little discouraging. And I'm also a racer, so I downhill race. And every year that I've raced, I've come away with a trophy. So I've been first place, second place, third place, but always a trophy in my pocket afterwards. I'm looking forward to this year because I missed last season, and I am ready to rock and roll on the slopes. I'm also very active in other sports. I sail. I have a 16-foot Hobie cat. In the past, I love sports. So in the past, I've skydived twice with an instructor. I used to hang glide, scuba dive, anything that's an adrenaline rush, I'm in for. I'll at least try it once.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, you missed, Eli was talking about his parachuting that he's done. So you've got that air stuff, air sports in common. So thank you. Thanks for filling in some of that. I am going to share my screen again and I'm going to go over a few things just to kind of fill in some information about transgender people in athletics, some of the laws, the anti-transgender laws that have been proposed. 33 states in the US have introduced over 100 bills that are trying to restrict the rights of transgender people across the country. 31 states have introduced bills that are specifically targeting transgender athletes. That's both, many of them are targeting youth in sports, but also some of them go beyond schools. So 10 states have already signed those bills into law. Now, Eli had given me a great resource to pass on to you as well. Transathlete.com is a great resource where you can find information about laws and advocacy, lots of different policy ideas. If you are thinking about within your own organization of looking to come up with policies, that could be helpful for you. And then I just wanted to briefly go over a few, sort of just to break through some of the myths about trans athletes. And I've pulled this together with some information that ACLU does, because they do a lot of advocacy work for transgender people. So if you look at the top myth, the participation of trans athletes hurts cis women. And I think that what you'll find almost across the board is that transgender women are the people who are targeted the most. Trans men usually don't, it doesn't come into the conversation, even though many of the laws would, right, and exactly, but the laws would affect trans men, but they don't come into the conversation. The focus is usually in restricting trans women. But really, it doesn't, excluding trans girls or women from competition is really a harmful precedent, because it really does invite all sorts of gender policing to go on, and invasive testing of girls and women. And I think that a lot of people do not want that kind of invasive policing to be broadened. Women and girls have enough problems to deal with in being restricted in society. And I think that also when you start banning certain people from athletics, you're really undermining the team cohesion and the kind of values that a lot of athletics have, which is about non-discrimination and inclusiveness. Another myth is to say that trans athletes' physiological characteristics provide an unfair advantage over cis athletes. And the fact really is that there is not an unfair advantage. People speak very often of the fact that there's diversity within every group of people. And so there will be people who will have athletic abilities across the board. But that this, Dr. Joshua Safer, in fact, says, for a trans woman athlete who meets NCAA standards, there is no inherent reason why her physiological characteristics related to athletic performance should be treated differently from the physiological characteristics of a non-transgender woman. And I think that that is something really to take to heart. Another myth that sex is binary, apparent at birth, and identifiable through singular biological characteristics. And that is to say that while we do think of male and female as a binary, that really there is a lot of diversity in the middle of those two categories. And that is something that is recognized within the medical community, and that it is not a strict, sex is not a strict binary. So when a person does not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, and they choose to transition socially, it's really important to include athletic participation and that's so important, especially with youth, because if you really do restrict early participation in sports, it can be really detrimental to their social development. And another myth is that trans students need separate teams. And I think that's, again, that sort of separate and equal, which we know is such a negative way of classifying people, separating people. And it's trying not to face up to the fact that if you're excluding transgender people from participation in any space, that is discrimination. And you can try and sugarcoat it in some other way, but you are trying to discriminate against transgender people. And actually, I am going to leave that for now. So those are just a few ideas to kind of combat some of those myths that are out there. And some of you may have some questions at this point for our speakers. I hope you've had a chance to kind of think about it. If you'd like to also, some of you I know are off screen. If you'd like to come on screen and ask anything, you can also send me a message in the chat if you'd like to do it that way. But we would love to answer questions for you. Does anyone have a question right off the bat?
If anyone else doesn't, I have a question.
Great.
In Eli, in your story, it was really interesting. I think it's really cool to hear how a lot of sports that are open and they aren't necessarily have to split up into a like men's and women's team. And it's something with the collegiate team that we coach around pronouns, where they a lot of times have referred to teams around like men's, this is the men's team and this is the women's team, and like, like the women as a collective. And, there are people on the women's team who, use they, them pronouns and, identify and are in that space. So I don't know if you have any, or either of you, or Jen as well, if you had any, anything to share around like, we actually just developed kind of a policy and a document of how we want to like refer to the group as a whole and using gender neutral terms. And I just didn't know if you had any experience with anything like that, or if, in sports that tend to sometimes be more gendered, how to go about, respecting people's pronouns.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think a lot of this is still areas that are in flux, and sports are kind of wrestling with this right now, no pun intended. But so I'll talk a bit about curling actually, because curling is a sport that, while it does have open teams that can be any combination of genders, there's also a phenomenon that at the elite level, curling very much is like men's, women's. And there's also a phenomenon called mixed, where you have to alternate players. The 4 players on the team have to go like man, woman, man, woman. And so we are talking about this in our club, on our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, in terms of the fact that even just our league descriptions, even for our open leagues, it doesn't say any gender may compete. It says like men or women may compete. So, we don't have any non-binary members of our club that we know of. But one of the questions we are wrestling with right now is, well, eventually there will be one, or someone will come out to us as either a current member or we'll get a new member. And how does it feel to be in our club if we're describing even our non-gendered leagues as like open to any combination of men or women? So one simple thing people can do, even when they do have gendered situations, is just keeping in mind like how things are described. So if you have crews that are any combination, then you just can describe them as any gender. And then you also have the issue of like, well, when people become more competitive and they know they're going into a system where there is this division of men, women, like what do you do there? And like, there isn't necessarily an easy answer right now in terms of non-binary folks and participation. But I would say that like when it's at that kind of community level, people who are in the sport to stay fit and have fun and meet people, and it's not like I want to go to nationals, like I think it's really important to provide opportunities for as much openness as possible, like open divisions or any combination kinds of groups. I don't know if that actually kind of answered the question you were asking, but one thing I try to keep in the back of my mind, even though I'm a binary trans person, my gender is male, is trying to think down that road of like, how will our sports be more open for non-binary folks? Because they are a rapidly growing demographic, especially among the young.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll step in now too. On the ski team that I race on, I'm actually on the women's team, and there are 50, 60 women racing of all different ages, from actually little kids all the way up through 80-year-olds on it. And we have men's and women's teams, but it's making me rethink that maybe we need to deal with this in our ski clubs, because our ski clubs have, I'm pretty sure, members that are not out, and maybe they're not out because they don't feel fully included in the clubs. And I know within my own club, I'm completely out, but I suspect we have a few members that may, in our club, that may fall into the LGBTQIA community who don't feel comfortable yet coming out. And maybe they would if they saw things like changing our skiing teams, instead of having men's and women's, have the more inclusive. And we certainly have some women that could put a real run for the money on the guys that are racing too. We have some phenomenal female athletes.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like that model, like the US Parachute Association is using, might work with something like an individual sport like skiing, where you just have like, everyone's going to race down this one course and everyone's going to get a time, and you're going to come in a certain order. And then if you need to divide things up for who goes on to whatever competition and that has divisions, then you can just say, okay, the top finisher in that division goes on, and not so much worry about like having to separate people right off the bat. Teams gets a little squidgier.
Yeah, exactly. Any other questions coming up?
While people are pondering questions, I'll add one more thing to my answer, in that our club does not have any all gender washrooms or changing facilities right now. So that's another way that people may not feel welcome. If all they have for options is the men's locker room and the women's locker room, you know, that can be a thing. So making sure that you have like at least one all gender place for someone to be able to feel comfortable.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that comes up so often when we talk about athletics, talking about locker rooms and bathrooms and changing and showering and stuff like that. And I wonder if there are some really positive things to recommend to athletic groups, or, you know, or within schools and stuff, to make sure that those are places that trans folks are included within the construction of those spaces and other policies. Do you have any ideas on that?
Oh, I'll jump in on that. You know, having been a high school teacher, you know, typically there's men's locker rooms and women's locker rooms in the schools. And when I was early on in my transition, the first move the schools had made was to have non-gender bathrooms available. Now, unfortunately, the non-gender bathrooms were teachers' single stall bathrooms that had been just reassigned the name non-gender. So they weren't where you would find the boys and girls rooms. So having bathrooms that make you feel included all together, men's, women's, non-gender, whatever, available, will make people feel included in it. I myself, I know first time I went in a women's locker room, it was like, I was very nervous about going in, am I going to fit in? Am I going to be accepted? Am I going to get attacked by anybody? And I've been fortunate to find exactly the opposite, that everyone's been incredibly welcoming to me. But I've known high school students who would only use the non-gender bathrooms because they themselves put their own roadblocks up, being afraid, in a school where everybody was pretty well accepted. So making them feel comfortable that they are accepted in any possible way is great. And I'll give an example of a restaurant that I went to where I felt very included. I went to use the restroom, and there were two of them, and both of them had the same sign on it. It had an image of a woman, an image of a man, and an image of an alien. And it just said, whatever, just wash your hands. And I said, that is one of the best things I've ever seen. It's like anybody can go in any one of these bathrooms and feel safe.
Great. And Eli just posted into the chat, if anyone is interested, a resource from the University of Vermont on multi-occupancy, any gender restrooms on campus. So if anybody's interested, they can take a peek at that. I do see a hand raised. So Lisa.
Hi guys, thanks so much. This is a really beautiful evening and so well spoken. So thanks to all of you and to CRI for holding it. I have a kind of two questions, and they're really both to our guests and to CRI. The first is that I'm a parent of a novice competitor, and I had a sense there was a recent day when the novice teams, both so-called boys and girls, were, I think, erging. And I just as an aside to let CRI know, I had a sense it wasn't exactly the open format that Eli is talking about, but there was I know some kids on the boys team, I know some kids on the girls team, and there was a kind of neat feeling that these athletes could sort of see each other a bit. So that's just an aside, and welcome your comments, both groups of folks here. And the second is, again, to both of you all experts, is that I know that there are, for example, some coxswains that so-called female coxswains coxing the so-called boys varsity team. And that's a really neat sort of example of blending that I wanted to bring to our host speakers, but just to have you all speak about that as well.
I think that's kind of fascinating. So it's okay. The rules allow for a girl to be the coxswain. It's coxswain, that's the right way to put it. Okay, on the boys' team in high school competitive rowing. And so it's really intriguing to me that there's not like a hue and cry about that. It's like, oh, she might have an unfair advantage because she's more likely to be smaller or weigh less. And I think that's something that you want, right? So it's like, that doesn't come up at all. And so it makes you wonder to what extent things are really about fairness. So who last has a boy, so he might weigh more. And to what extent it's just about something else. Yeah, that's fascinating.
I was just gonna chime in, and I just thank you, Lisa, for bringing up that point, because that's something that I didn't even think of. And you can, on the other side as well, have male coxswain on female teams. And that's just, in, some sports that tend to be very gendered, where you have like a male's team and a women's team, there isn't really that crossover. So I think that is really interesting in thinking about the future and how do we make these teams more open and welcoming and accessible to everyone, that is something that's already kind of happening, which I didn't even think of it in that same light, which is really cool. And I also just wanted to build off of coaching at CRI and seeing both those teams work together, I think is great. And because you just have they both share a lot of, I've been experienced that, and they share a lot of respect for, both teams for what they do. And I think it's just, again, a step in the right direction to moving towards a really inclusive space where people feel really open, just knowing who's on the other teams and things like that. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yes, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. Anyone else have some questions or thoughts, comments? So we have a mixture of youth who are involved with the organization and parents here. Is that right? That's cool.
Yeah, bit of a mix. Well, I don't want to cut off. If anyone, has any questions, feel free. But if Eli or Jen or Ellen, if you have anything you want to say to wrap up, or any kind of next segment that you wanted to do, we can move on to that. I know you had some more slides, Ellen. I don't know if you wanted to.
Yeah, I could go on to that for a little bit, but I did want to mention, and maybe the two of you can talk about this if you want to, about like how can people feel involved and be able to help make a difference in whether it's their own athletic club or group that they're involved with, or even on a bigger advocacy level, to make sure that that they can make a difference to combat some of these anti-transgender laws, et cetera.
I'll jump in. 6 months ago, I went to my dentist, and my dentist grabbed me out front in the waiting area and said, I need to talk to you in private. And I've known him for many years, and prior to me being Jen even. So he knows my whole story and everything, and he's a skier. He and I get along really well. And he grabbed me and dragged me over to a corner so no one else could hear, and said, what do you think of transgender athletes and how they fit in to sports today? And I thought just the fact that he asked the question, that he wants to start dealing with it. So having the conversation with people about it and get talking with as many people as possible about this, so that they really understand how transgender athletes may feel about whether they're included or excluded, because they may not think of that point. They may only be thinking about how others on the team are affected by, instead of what's the other side of the story, and how to make everybody else included.
Thanks, Jen. Any thoughts on that, Eli?
I'm going to kind of piggyback a little. This doesn't quite get at the question you asked, but I wanted to loop back to this anyway, and it piggybacks a bit on what Jen was saying. In terms of one way to be supportive, and this is not so much about huge, big advocacy things, but just on a one-on-one level, is there's kind of like some do's and don'ts for talking to the trans people or presumably trans people around you. And so one is that if you know someone's trans, it's always a kind of a good idea, a good rule of thumb to lead with, like, is it okay if I ask you a question about your experience as a trans person? Like, don't expect that people will do that for you. So like Jen and I are both very, very open and very into educating folks. And so the answer is probably going to be, yeah, of course. But just asking that first before you launch into the question is really helpful, just to kind of like, as a courtesy of like, would you be willing to share this? Because sometimes it can be, for many trans people who are less privileged than I, like it can be draining. It can be emotionally difficult to talk about some of these negative experiences. So like just checking in to make sure is always a good idea. And then a lot of us are very willing to do that. And then kind of just want to tell a quick story of like two different folks in my curling club. And they're two very different responses to me as a trans person that made a huge difference. So my curling club men's league was the first time I ever tried to do something called going stealth. And this was about three years ago. where a trans person doesn't tell anyone they're trans. And just tries to go about life like as the gender they identify with. And so in this one league, I was just signed up for this men's league at this brand new club I was a member of, and I was like, let's see what happens. And I was pretty sure like by day one, people are gonna be like, that's a trans guy. Because again, I transitioned kind of late. My voice didn't drop as much as it would if I were younger or things like that when I transitioned. But anyway, so I joined this men's league, I get put on a team, whatever, we're doing the thing, and then like several weeks in, this one guy comes up to me and he does the thing that every trans person knows is what we know what's coming next. He's kind of like, hey, can I ask you a question? And like people just have this look. I don't know, this vibe. You can smell it coming off of me. Know what it's about. I'm like, sure. And he's like, are you transgender? And again, because I'm so open, I'm like, yeah, and I'd appreciate you keeping it just between us because I'm trying to just kind of like be me here and not have it be a big deal. And he's like, oh yeah, absolutely. But then after that, this guy would bring it up like almost every week. Like, he'd be like, oh, I saw an article about, the thing or whatever. Or like, asking me kind of questions again, without asking, can I ask you this stuff? Like, and it just became kind of invasive and almost creepy. Like one time he even was like, hey, like come in the back room. I want to ask you something. And I was like, no, like one, because I knew what it was about. And two, I'm like, this is weird. I don't want to go in the dark kitchen with you. And like, so like, that's a no. Like, that's a hard no. Like, even just the initial question, again, because I'm an activist, that was okay with me, but that's actually probably not okay to do to regular trans people. Like, don't just flat out ask people if they're trans. Like, they'll tell you when it's time. On the other hand, the guy who's now like my curling coach, he was the team I got put on. And he never said a word to me until one day, like, I don't know, a year later, I made some joke about being trans, and he kind of this look on his face like, oh, okay, like I can do the thing now. And I asked him like a couple of years later, hey, did you have me figured out? And he's like, not at first, but there were two things where I was like, I wonder. But that's all he had ever done was wonder. It's because I always use the stall. I never use the urinal. And he noticed I had small hands when he shook them. And he was like, he's really small hands. But that's the yes to do what he did. He just treated me regular, never brought it up. Once I brought it up, he was like, oh, okay. Like, then it felt like a thing we could talk about one-on-one, but he's never brought it up if other people are around, unless he knows I'm out to those people. So that's like, you're kind of like your do's and don'ts there. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for bringing those up. Were you going to say something, John?
Yes. I just wanted to bring something up about being supportive, and I'll give an example. And this happened at my ski club. We were sitting on the front porch, bunch of us having some drinks, and there was a woman from another club, and she was pretty well under the table, and she brought up how members in her club had, two men were actually having an issue, and they were doing things like putting signs on the bathrooms that said, no transgender people allowed. And members of my club and ski team were so incredibly supportive. They would not let the conversation continue. They changed the subject immediately. And over the next week, somebody spoke with this woman, and because she didn't know that I was trans at all, and explained to her that it was a bad thing what she had done. And I didn't think it was bad because there was no intent there from her. She was just stating something that was going on in her club. And she sent me a long email a week later because someone at my club explained it to her. She apologized to me for her actions, which I felt bad because she probably felt bad about it. And she didn't do anything that was wrong. She just talked about something. But when I responded to her, I thanked her for writing the email. But I also said to her, this will actually make a difference in whether I want to attend a party at your club. I may not feel safe going into your club because of what you've told me, which is interesting because I had been to her club many times and to many parties, and no one's ever said anything bad to me there at all. So I would go anyway, regardless of what she had told me went on, but it would give me the opportunity to maybe speak to somebody. If she told me who it was, I might have said something to some of the individuals. One of the other things I run into racing, I've caught members of some of the other clubs at the finish line, they'll look at one of their friends who's skiing down and he'll race and he didn't do so well. And their reaction to him when they went to speak to him was, "That's so gay."
Hmm.
And it's like, what does that have to do with anything? It's like this is prevalent, has been prevalent for many years in high schools, kids using "that's so gay." And it's a real challenge to try to get rid of that terminology.
Yeah, it is. It still is in the schools. But I did want to mention though, Jen, even though you weren't, you didn't think that woman had done this horrible thing or whatever. But I do think what was good about that is that your friends did take an initiative and to do something. And I think that that's really important for cisgender allies to, when they're observing something that they feel is uncomfortable and should not, continue, and they are protective of you and your feelings. It's a really good thing to be a cisgender ally in a situation like that. And even if you don't know if there is a transgender person present, but if people are saying anti-trans things, then step forward and counter what is being talked about, and challenge the anti-trans things that might be being said. It's really hard to leave that weight on transgender people for them to always have to do the work. So it's good for us as allies, as cisgender allies, to take that on. And unless anyone has any other questions, thank you very much. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your time. And we really appreciate being invited into your space to have this kind of discussion, because it really is important work to talk about transgender experience, to talk about how it is affecting people within athletics. And yeah, thank you so much for having us into your Zoom box tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no, I was just going to say thank you, Eli and Jen and Ellen. I didn't want to get any of you off again. Sorry, Eli. The awkward wait, but thank you again, Ellen, and thank you. Sorry, I was just reading something in the chat, but I really just want to say thank you, and I'm really excited. This is our first time working with SpeakOUT Boston, but I'm really excited. I think this is hopefully the beginning of continuing to have discussions or events or be involved with each other. So I'm again, just thank you so much. It's been really great. I think hearing stories. One thing through the pandemic, not being able to be together is really difficult, but the beauty of Zoom is like being able to all come together and really hear people's experiences firsthand, I think is something that's just so important. So I really appreciate Eli and Jen, your just sharing your stories, and thank you all again for coming out again. I know during a very busy week, but we're looking forward to hopefully doing more in the future. So thank you again. And if you have any questions, reach out.
Okay. Thanks so much, Lily. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.